panelists, one from the Department of Religion, one from the Department of Philosophy, and a genetic professor from, I'm guessing, where are you? The Department of Genetics. I imagine that. So again, I'm going to read from a script. Dr. Alan Goblis, who sat on my committee, the head of my committee. Dr. Goblis is an associate professor in the Department of Religion at the University of Georgia. The University of Georgia teaches Islamic studies and Arabic courses, as well as a survey course on the world's religions, and a freshman seminar on emotions, emotional intelligence, and the world's religions. He co-directs the UGA Arabic major and the UGA Morocco May Master program, which, if you get a chance, I highly recommend going to Morocco. Dr. Mike Arnold of the Department of Genetics. Dr. Arnold is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Genetics, I mentioned that, at the University of Georgia. Members of his lab have tested evolutionary hypotheses, is that right? In a wide array of organisms, including fungi, plants, and animals. Their group has examined a range of phenomena, help me out here, man, associated with the process of gene exchange between organisms in nature. And then Dr. Edward Harper, or Halper? Dr. Halper is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Georgia. The focus of his work is the classical problem of metaphysics. For Halper's latest work is Aristotle's Metaphysics, A Reader's Guide, published by Continuum Press. Dr. Halper also writes about Plato, Hegel, as well as Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Jewish philosophy. And if you get them around the hand, so we don't really have any order for this. What I'm going to do is I have a set list of questions that will probably deviate at a certain point. I'm going to throw them out, and if any one of you would like to jump in there first and answer the question, that'd be great. If all three of you can answer it, that'd be great. If you don't want to answer the question, just let me know. The first question we came up with is, can everyone hear me? Or am I speaking into my podium too much?
I thought you wanted us to make a presentation.
What's that?
You wanted us to make a 15-minute presentation? You going to do that, or?
You want to do that? Is that how we're going to do 15-minute presentation?
That was what we were told. Weren't you told?
Right, then we can do that. So, you want to start with the 15-minute presentation? Sure.
Got myself into this one. All right. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Okay. All right, so they told me to be ready to speak for 15 minutes, and I figured that would be enough time to give you a brief history of philosophy in the world, and after I finished with a history of philosophy, I would have enough time maybe to talk a little bit about Maimonides. That was supposed to be funny, incidentally, but so I'll have to clue you about what the jokes are here. All right, so I'll begin with the history of philosophy, and I might as well start with ancient Greek philosophy, which is one area where I work in. In ancient Greek philosophy, there's an idea that you can explain the world by focusing on the nature of individual things. So this is true in Plato, and it's true in Aristotle, it's true of every Greek philosopher that we know. And Plato and Aristotle are the most famous, and we have the most extensive corpus of their works, and I will just give you a very brief summary of how this works. If we want to understand human nature, we have to find our essence. And then we have to account for our various attributes in terms of our essence. So what it is to be human, well, what distinguishes us from other animals is that we have a capacity to think. Other animals don't do that. They do other things. Beavers build dams, and they live in characteristic ways. Dogs bark, and they do other things that dogs do. And my knowledge will be quickly exhausted. But what's distinctive about each one is the essential nature of each one. What's distinctive about us is our essential nature. And the Aristotelian idea is that once you understand the essential nature, you can account for the attributes of a thing through their essential nature. So we have a capacity to think, I said, and one of the things that we do is we walk upright on 2 feet. Why do we do that? So that, the answer is clear, once you, it helps us to think. How so? Because standing upwards, we gaze at the heavens, and the heavens have a regular order. And we can be aware of the regular order, and we can understand the mathematics behind this regular order, and thereby arrive at eternal truths. This is Aristotle. And these eternal truths are about the nature and structure of the universe. Now, other animals don't do this. They do something else. Each has its own essential nature, and the attributes that other animals have can be explained in terms of their essential nature. I've only talked about walking on 2 feet. Aristotle talks about hair on the head, eyebrows. He even talks about long intestines. All of these things help us to think, strange as it may seem. And other animals have different characteristics that help them to be what they are. Now, I'm just going to, the mic seems to be going on and off, yeah? Can you hear me? No, it went off. It is on. It's the on button is on here. What should I do?
It should be out.
You think I see what it is. I'm pressing the antenna in the wrong way. Okay. So is it on now? Yeah? Okay. No. Is it on? It's on now. Okay. This is a very, very strange operation here. I will try to hold it out here. All right. So I'm just going to quickly repeat here my brief history of the Western. You think that this won't be better? All right. Okay, is that better? Can you hear me now? Good. Okay, so just to repeat the brief history of the Western world here, Western philosophy. I started with Greek philosophy, and everybody thinks that there are things that have essences, and you can understand the essences of things, and you can understand characteristic attributes that things have in terms of their essences. So if we talk about human beings, our essence is to think. We can explain why we walk upright, because that helps us think. And Aristotle goes on to talk about having hair on our heads, having eyebrows, having 2 arms, 2 legs, even talking about how having a long intestine helps us to do the thing that we do that characterizes us, that makes us as we are. Now, other animals have different essences. Dogs do whatever it is that they do that makes them dogs. And I don't know much about that. I'm sure other people do know what is distinctive about dogs. And cows do what's distinctive about cows. And you can account, in Aristotelian science, you can account for the characteristics they have by understanding the essence. Because whatever other attributes they have, they contribute to the essential function of the thing, the function that makes the thing what it is. All right, now this is a very interesting way of understanding the universe, but there's obviously a very big problem with it. Because you can understand individual natures and the things that are essential to the nature, but what you can't really understand is how one nature interacts with another nature. Now, of course, we need food to survive, so we can understand our need for food, but it isn't essential to us to have strawberries or to have cows or to have other particular animals. So what you have is a world in which what gets explained are individual natures, and what doesn't get explained, or explained very well, is the interaction between those individual natures. And as a result, the Aristotelian world, and this is true of all of ancient Greek philosophy, is a world that's permeated by chance and fortune. There's a lot that is a matter of chance, and a lot that can't be known. In Plato, it's true even more so than in Aristotle. Plato says there are things that are known, that are eternal, and truthful, they're always the same. And then there's the sensible world, and the sensible world is always changing, and none of it can be known. So, philosophy in the ancient world consists of making a distinction between things that are knowable because they're eternal, unchanging, and things that, like essence and our essential natures and so forth, and things that are matters of chance and therefore unknowable. Now, the second movement in the history of philosophy here, zipping along here, going pretty quickly over 7 or 8 centuries or so, along comes religion. And this is true, it's true of Judaism, it's true of Christianity, and it's true of Islam. Because there's a commonality to all 3 religions. And the commonality is that there is one principle, God, that knows everything. So here's the problem. According to ancient Greek philosophy, there's a lot that's a matter of chance and unknowable. As religion enters the picture, there is now nothing that is unknowable to God. So we have an enormous challenge, and the challenge was taken up by a group of philosophers who are known collectively as medieval philosophers, not so much because they lived in the Middle Ages, as because they had a different kind of problematic. They had the task of reconciling religion and the possibility of a religion with philosophy. And they are inconsistent insofar as ancient Greek philosophers think that there's such a thing as chance and the unknowable. In medieval philosophy, in the Middle Ages, once you fall off. In order to meet the challenge, philosophers and theologians in the Middle Ages had to develop a whole set of philosophical ideas and ways of understanding the world to make it intelligible. They went way beyond ancient Greek philosophers because religion provided a kind of intellectual imperative that forced them to think about issues that the ancient philosophers were happy to set aside. I could go on and on about these developments. I find them interesting and exciting. But all I want to do is just present the idea that the emergence of religion created a new imperative that really forced people to think about different ideas and create different ideas, different ways to understand the world. The Middle Ages, we know, ended with the rise of the Renaissance and the early modern period in the 17th century. And what happens then is that initially God drops out of the picture here. Well, we still have a God. The philosophers are talking about God, proving the existence of God. But now we want to understand the world without bringing in a divine being that knows everything. And what do we have? We have scientific laws that account for the interactions of bodies and the account for, in principle, everything in the world. The rise of modern philosophy is the rise of the idea that everything is knowable, just as those medieval philosophers said, in contrast with what the ancient philosophers said, knowable through scientific law. They made a point of doing what the medieval philosophers had done with God and religion. The modern philosophers attempted to do without God and without religion. But notice, it's the same project, done now very differently. And it's a whole new way of thinking that comes into the picture. But the project is there because of the religious imperative to make the world knowable. And to figure out ways in which we could know the world. Okay, 17th century was a long time ago. As the 17th century progresses, there is increasingly doubt about, guess what? The knowability of the world. because it seems that these intellectual structures that the modern philosophers had invented or discovered in order to know the world didn't quite work out very well. And you have the rise of different sorts of laws until the question about certain things that can't be known by reason, and then the rise of different sorts of laws until the early 20th century, when there is skepticism about the possibility of really knowing the world at all, whether there are determinate laws that govern the behavior of bodies. At this point, we have the rise of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century. The quantum mechanics is a theory of physics that is statistical, and as long as I'm explaining to you the history of Western philosophy in 10 minutes or so, I might as well throw in quantum mechanics here. Why not? Everything else. The idea in quantum mechanics is we can't talk about a body behaving in one way following a particular law. What we need to do is look at the ensemble, the whole array of different bodies, and the statistical possibilities of them being in one position and behaving in one way or another way, and we can't really understand one bit of matter by itself. So we have a kind of emergence of this ancient Greek notion of the unintelligibility of the world. And there's a very interesting discussion, I'm just going to mention this, between Heisenberg, you may know Heisenberg uncertainty principle, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and Einstein, who had founded relativity theory, which is a classical theory of physics. And Einstein says to Heisenberg, God doesn't play dice. Right? There's something wrong with your theory because it doesn't explain everything. And if we are trying to account for the world has to be knowable. The world is not going to be knowable on your account. And of course, Heisenberg responds back, don't tell God what to do. There's an idea here that the religious question, the question of the knowability of the world, set the agenda. And it set an agenda that really continues in the scientific world today. And I want to suggest that they're not, that they are helping each other because of this religious question, there is the philosophical and scientific development of new ways of thinking about the world, which began in the Middle Ages, were developed by modern philosophers, and continue today. This is a very productive interaction. I'm going to, now that I've given you the history of philosophy in 10 minutes, I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Jewish philosophy. In particular, a philosopher who lived in the 12th century, whose name is Maimonides. And Maimonides wrote a book called The Guide of the Perplexed, or For the Perplexed. It's not clear that whether he was the one who was perplexed or whether the readers were perplexed and he was going to help them. But it's a long work which is very interesting. Maimonides begins with an Aristotelian idea that human nature is to have the potential to learn, potential for knowledge, just as we saw in Aristotle. That's the opening chapter. By the end of the book, Maimonides is talking about the various things that we can know. And we can know various, I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them is we can know the world, and we can know the world scientifically. And the claim is that a person who follows a religious life will be in a better position to pursue knowledge. And not only that, it's even stronger than that. A person who follows a religious life has an injunction to pursue knowledge. You can't follow the religious life, you can't be properly religious if you are not exercising your capacity to learn by pursuing knowledge, and all sorts of knowledge. It doesn't mean just knowledge of religion, but scientific knowledge as well. And I'm going to end here with Maimonides' description of Job, book of Job. You've heard of this, right? Job was tested by God, right? Job begins by saying Job was a righteous man. But great troubles befell him. And he goes through an enormous suffering. He loses his wife, his children, the worst things that you can possibly imagine befall Job. Now Maimonides interprets this and he says, this is a parable. Probably didn't happen, but it's there to teach us something. Job was an upright man. He was morally virtuous. He did everything he was supposed to do. But what we don't hear about Job is he didn't develop his capacity for knowledge. He didn't pursue science of any sort. And Maimonides says the lesson that we should derive from this is that it's not enough to believe, it's not enough to follow religious law, it's not enough to be moral. It's more important, it's crucially important to realize your human potential for knowledge and to develop your mind to come to know the world. I want to suggest that religion and philosophy, religion and science go hand in hand, that it's a kind of a religious injunction, at least in Judaism, to pursue knowledge and to continue the development of your pursuit of knowledge. They won't contradict. If they do, it's always possible, Maimonides says, to reinterpret religion. Religion and science are not antithetical to each other. They go hand in hand. If they seem to conflict, we need to go back to the religious texts and understand them in a way so that they are consonant with our scientific truths. So I'm going to end there.
Hello. Let's see. Can you hear me back there? Okay. Well, as you may realize, I'm godless. And it's a joke, but it's actually my name. So it's been something that I've always had to grapple with, even though when I was growing up, I was not particularly religious. And what led me to the study of religion was actually three major problems that I was grappling with when I was growing up, but in particular that came to a head when I was in college, which was as an undergraduate, 1969, 1970, 1971. And these three problems were the violence that people seemed to be committing that was out of control. At that time, the two major violent problems, aside from the overall Cold War atmosphere, in which people were building fallout shelters and expecting nuclear bombs any second, aside from that, there was the Vietnam War, and everyone who was in college those days was concerned about the Vietnam War because we had the draft. And 1 minute you could be here, and then you could be out there fighting in Vietnam. So that was one issue. Vietnam, also the Israeli-Palestinian problem periodically was breaking through into the news. That was another problem. So violence, and aside from crime and people killing each other on the streets every day, violence and out-of-control violence, people killing each other for apparently reasons that didn't seem to be particularly necessary all the time. Given some kinds of violence were necessary, but it seemed to be out of control. That was one problem, out-of-control violence. And again, these are the problems that led me to investigate both science and religion. The other problem was the ecological problem. And this is very personal to me because when I was growing up, the main joy that I took out of life, the main joy that I received in life was by being in nature, was by, I was a tree hugger, basically. And I loved animals. I loved unspoiled nature. Where I grew up, however, was on the edge of suburbia in Southern California, which seemed like endless asphalt. Later on, when I would go to New York, I would understand the meaning of endless asphalt. But at the time, it seemed like people were just raping the environment. And this seemed just out of control. And in spite of what many people were objecting, in spite of the fact that many people were objecting to this. So this was a problem. And then the third problem was that I realized that I loved life, and that at one point, I didn't know when, I was going to die. So I began to, and so you can probably relate to me, you all are going to die at a certain point. You don't know when you're going to die. You may die tomorrow. A friend of mine in our religion, you may get a stroke tomorrow. One of our colleagues in the Department of Religion just had a stroke, younger than me. So all of us are going to die, I realized. Problems haven't seemed to have changed. Violence is still out of control. The environment is still being raped on a daily basis. But over the last 40 years, I've tried to understand, both from the perspective of science and from the perspective of religion, how we can deal with these issues. So I began my academic career actually studying the sciences, the natural sciences, because that was what I felt closest to nature. And I had the most handle on understanding nature. And so I studied ecology. And this led me into political action. At that time, in around 1970, this is when the first Earth Day happened. And I began doing some lobbying in the state legislature in California, where I was living and going to school. But all of my attempts and other people's attempts to try to change things on a political level were stifled. And I began to ask, why does this occur? Why are people not recognizing what appears to be the obvious? How can apparently rational people not see that these are major problems and not agree on solutions? Nothing seems to have changed in 40 years. In any case, I began looking into the fact that it appears that one of the major obstacles to solutions of both the ecological problem and the problem of violence from people to each other, to other people, I began to look into the problem of the individual ego, that people seem to be unaware of how to stop themselves from compulsively acting in an egoistical way for self-preservation in their own minds. They seem to be unable and unaware that we seem to be unaware and unable to stop ourselves from being egoistical. So I began looking into psychology at that time. And eventually that led me into the study of religion as well, because I thought that it seemed to me that prior to the advent of modern science, people began to investigate who they were, began to try to understand who they were. They began to try to understand the obstacle, the ways in which the self contributes to problems. They did this for many hundreds of years, many thousands of years, in within the umbrella of religion. Although certainly there's much more to religion than self-inquiry. So after getting through my studies in ecology after becoming familiar and getting a scientific appreciation of the diversity of species on our planet and how diversity contributes to the well-being of life on our planet, the ability of ecological systems, for example, to rebound after a disaster, is dependent to a large degree on the diversity of species present. This was a basic ecological theory at the time, and it still is important in ecology, the relationship between diversity of species and the ecological stability of communities. So from the perspective of natural science and the perspective of psychology, I began to inquire and study religion. And so what this has brought me to, and I'll just say a few things now, and if there's time later on, I'll revisit this. What this brought me to, these three problems of out-of-control violence between other people, and the ecological problem, which is kind of violence against the environment, and then the problem that all of us are going to die, and we don't know when, we don't know how much time we have. These three problems led me to look at what is the major obstacle, especially an obstacle that I might be able to understand and do something about, and each of us may possibly be able to do something about. What is the major obstacle to more thoroughly understanding these problems and finding solutions to them? And so again, to repeat myself, I came to look into the fact that our lack of knowledge of ourselves, and in particular my lack of knowledge of my unconscious and compulsive egoism, I began to look into this as a contributing, if not the main cause, to our lack of solutions to these three problems. And in terms of what I've come to now as to what science says about this and what religion says about this, basically from a scientific perspective, it seems that science gets us close to understanding this. The scientific method in particular, in that a core aspect of the scientific method is any time a scientist makes an observation, they have to recognize and note down the degree to which the accuracy of the observing instrument is influencing their observations. You may remember from your high school chemistry class, anytime you wrote down an equation, you had to write plus or minus 0.000, whatever. That plus or minus is the degree of accuracy of your observing instrument. And so it's extremely important. As far as I understood the scientific method, and those of you who are scientists, please feel free to correct me, it seemed to me at the time that science made it imperative that we understand the degree of accuracy of our observing instrument. And ultimately, one of the common features in any scientist's observation is that each of us, if we're scientists, are doing the observation. We are the observing instrument, ultimately. Later on, Heisenberg, with his uncertainty principle, talks about the degree to which the observer is influencing anything that they are observing, but that's an additional point. The major aspect of the scientific method, it seemed to me, was the importance of recognizing how we as scientists, as observers, are influencing and the degree to which we're influencing whatever it is that we're observing. From a perspective of Greek philosophy, it was imperative to know thyself, for going back to the beginnings. And then in religion, what I found is that in the world's religions, this was also an important aspect. The that the lack of self-knowledge, the degree to which we lack self-awareness, can distort whatever it is we happen to be thinking, even if we're the most pious person. The lack of awareness of how we are influencing our beliefs can distort whatever it is we happen to be saying. So both from the perspective of science and religion, I've been led to the importance of understanding the degree to which our unconscious and compulsive egoism affects whatever it is we happen to be saying. And it makes it more difficult to reconcile science and religion to the degree we're not aware of how our unconscious egoism is affecting us. Most recently, I've been studying emotional intelligence, and I'm happy to report that the most rigorous of the models of emotional intelligence, which was developed by someone who's now the provost at Yale University, which indicates to me that the model is receiving generally widespread acceptance, the most rigorous model of emotional intelligence, what it points us to is that in order to try to come to solutions to these problems that I've been addressing, we need to enhance our emotional intelligence. And to the degree that we lack emotional intelligence, self-awareness of our emotions being one of the factors of emotional intelligence, to the degree that we lack that, we will lack the ability to wisely solve these problems, among which is how do we integrate religion and science. So I'll stop there, and if we need to, I'll go further into that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Francis, you can sleep now. That's my wife back there. She said she was going to bring a newspaper and read it while I talk so I would feel like I was in class. So, let's see. Is that working okay? All right. Wow. Thank you, guys. So really what I want to do is just say ditto, because I don't know all the things that they just talked about. But actually, it's a great introduction. I want to tell you that as a evolutionary biologist, a empirical scientist, and as what my friends would probably call a conservative Christian, I feel like one of those UN peacekeepers. You know, you wear that stupid blue helmet and everybody shoots at you. But that's okay. That's actually all right, because another of my friends, who is very wise, calls my position a healthy tension, which I retorted, it doesn't feel real healthy to me. But that's all right as well. So Dr. Wyatt Anderson's here, and Professor Anderson was the dean of, sorry to put you on the spot, Wyatt, you don't have to raise your hand. He was the dean of arts and sciences, and he and I, for many years, taught evolutionary biology together, undergraduate evolutionary biology. And he came to me one time and asked if he knew that I was religious, and he had these crazy ideas, but was also a scientist. And he wanted to know if I would be willing to co-lead with him a discussion with our undergraduate evolutionary biology students on faith and science, or this, whatever you want to call it. It was the most well-attended of any of the classes. I think there were a lot of extra students there that actually didn't attend our class. And it got me to wondering, why there was such great interest in this. I mean, I'm interested in it, but all of us professors are interested in things that you probably go home and laugh about usually and go, can you believe that they're interested in that? But the students really seem to be intrigued about that. And one of the things that they seem to be most intrigued by is when I talk to them and Wyatt talked to them about our personal experiences, how we ended up where we were doing the things that we were doing with our different worldviews. And so just to briefly say that, as you guys have mentioned, I mean, we all sort of converge on religion or a belief system, I think, because we're challenged by various things. My personal belief system says that unless God bowls into your life, you're not going to have a religious experience with Him. Okay? That's what I believe. It's called grace. And so that kind of a religious experience for me has been something that permeates my entire life. I love my career. I absolutely adore studying evolutionary biology. And I think that's what I was designed to do by God, believe it or not. But those two things really do hold together as a tension. Okay, because there are teachings, there are things that we're taught as from different religions, and it's not just actually Christianity. I have a very good friend in Turkey he is a Muslim, and Muhammad and I were talking. Francis and I went over there for me to set up some research projects this summer, and he and I were talking. And he said, he's a scientist, a very good scientist. He said, I can go up to, with evolutionary biology, I can go up to Adam and Eve, but I can't go there. Which is just like Wallace said. He said, I can go up to evolution, all the way up to humans, but I can't buy into humans evolving. So it's not just, we get wrapped up in our culture, I think, sometimes our Western culture, and we sort of see that as a dichotomy between science and religion in general. Scientists are dangerous because they have these crazy ideas and they'll lead impressionable undergraduates to do terrible things. Y'all do terrible things on your own, by the way. I've had 2 undergraduates of my own. Wyatt's had a bunch of his. We know we don't have to encourage you to do anything. But the thing about it is, what I would like to challenge you in, you're here so you have some level of interest in this topic, is don't be scared of it. Don't be frightened. And if you are very religious, let's say you're, like me, a conservative Christian. You may have been taught for a very long time, or maybe you're a conservative Muslim, like Muhammad. You may have been taught for a very long time that science is dangerous, particularly certain kinds of science, because it'll lead you away from your faith. Let me encourage you, God's a whole lot bigger than that. Okay? He's not scared of you learning things. All right? So, my encouragement to you is use this as these kinds of discussions as a platform, as somehow of bringing yourself to challenge yourself to look at these honestly, these questions, because hiding them, there's 40 or 50% of all the population in the U.S. is supposedly, I don't know how they do these polls. I don't know how they figure out who's going to win the presidency, because they're always wrong about that too, it seems like. But they say that 50% of our population doesn't hold to an evolutionary worldview. Okay? That actually doesn't bother me. Dawkins goes nuts. He says we're all crazy, we have a disease over here in the U.S., we're imbeciles, which I find good. I like that. I like when he goes off because his head explodes. But anyway, the thing about it is, what I don't like about that, though, is if we're not thinking. If 50% of us are just basically on 50%, 25% that think evolution is the way that everything happened, and 25% of that other population that aren't thinking either. You know what I mean? I mean, if we think, then we can actually dialogue. The three of us can chat with one another. We don't have to yell. We don't have to have diatribes. We don't have to have, I hate political debates. I don't even watch them. They make me cringe. But we don't have to have those sorts of things. We can actually dialogue about commonalities, but also recognize that these two guys have a very different belief system to me. Okay? I mean, that's the bottom line. And if we can't accept that, then we'll never progress and never move into one another's worlds, which I think is personally is sad, whether it's science, it's religion, it's whatever. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope I didn't take more than 15. I think I'm looking forward to seeing what the questions are. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
You guys answered all the questions. Thank you. Good night. You guys did cover some of these questions. What I've been given is a list of like 5 or 6 questions. And I kind of went through them yesterday. You guys did cover a lot of this. And since we got started late with student classes, what I want to do is open up a panel discussion. I'm going to ask some questions, but I also want to introduce you guys to this panel discussion. I was going to have a question and answer period after I got through my questions or the questions given to me. But I think if we can get you guys involved, we can cover both my questions and the question and answer period at the same time. And all I'm going to ask you guys is don't be shy. I've stood in front of enough classrooms that people stare back at you. And I got to tell you that most professors and teachers, they don't like that. They like students that engage. So, and I know this subject matter, a lot of people have questions on because before I came here and I was talking to my friends who work in the film business like me on the side, they're all asking me a whole bunch of questions. I'm like, well, email me these questions because then I can ask them, and they never did because the film industry. But I would like to know that some of you have come here with questions. And I'm sure some of them answered, and I think it was very intriguing. Because what I felt was like there was philosophy and history and religion, and then there was ecology, psychology, and religion, and then religion coming from the person that I think a lot of people like. He's a genetic scientist. He's not going to be the religious guy, you know. And I know they're all religious gentlemen, but this is just kind of like, oh, this is intriguing to me. So what I'm going to do, and I'm sorry if these questions seem a little simplistic. Again, these are ones that were given to me. And if I give them to you and you don't want to answer them, you can even tell me these are crazy.
Anything you give us that's simplistic, professors can make complicated. Don't worry about it. We'll do it.
So, I was first going to have you guys, and you've already done this, so if you feel like you've done this, we'll move on. But, would you care to offer a perspective on what science and religion encompasses within the scope of this panel discussion? Like, do you feel like there's a definition of science that you would like to limit this panel discussion to, or that is relevant to the topic matter?
Let's see. So I think it's useful for me to focus on the way, when we speak of science, to speak about the scientific method. And to emphasize, at least if we're trying to integrate science and religion or have a dialogue with science and religion, to me the most fruitful aspect of science is to focus on what exactly is the scientific method and how and to look at, let's say, if there is an extremist fundamentalist scientist, how do we define that? How do we define such a person in terms of his or her relationship, or in terms of his or her relationship to the scientific method? Are they actually practicing the scientific method? And the same thing holds true from a religious perspective. What, in other words, my hypothesis is that extremist fundamentalist religious people have certain things in common with extremist fundamentalist scientists who are in conflict with each other. It's not just their different theories that they have in common. There are certain commonalities in the way that they approach science and religion, that certain common features that they share, which to me have to do with a lack of focus on the scientific method from the perspective of science, and more of an emphasis on trying to uphold particular paradigms within science. That's from the scientific perspective. And then from a religious perspective, what extremist fundamentalists of all religions seem to me to have in common is a similar lack of awareness of the degree to which their own egotism and absence of humility is affecting whatever it is that they're saying. So this is what, to me, would be useful to, and I hope people will pursue, is to address this issue of the nature of the scientific method and how a kind of healthy skepticism and a recognition that scientific observations periodically, that the paradigms in which scientific observations are made periodically are changed through various scientific revolutions. So both some approaches to the scientific method as well as to religion, they emphasize humility. Humility in the sense of an awareness of the limitations, of oneself as a devotee of God, or the limitations of oneself as an observer. And just one last thing is that one example of limitations that science has uncovered is to expose the fallacy of common sense. For example, common sense says that you go outside and of course the sun is rising. But science has completely overturned that. The sun isn't rising. Also, science tells us, if I say, for example, don't move. Try not to move right now. All of you, don't move. Are you moving? What does science say? Yeah, science says you're moving at 62,000 miles an hour around the sun. Completely overturning common sense. So this is where what I'd like to focus on is what the two have in common regarding their methodologies at best.
My question to you then, with that, is the commonality, from your perspective, between the center, is that the center of where science and religion relate, versus the fundamentalists who do not believe in that commonality? You're talking about a commonality between science and is exclusively away from the fundamental approaches to science and fundamentalist approaches, or extremist approaches between religion and science. And what is in the center there? Is that the commonality you find, is they're not taking this extremist approach or fundamentalist approach? Or?
Yeah, rather than me continuing to address this, it would be better if my colleagues would felt comfortable talking about it, or if someone in the audience wanted to especially fill in my naive understanding of the scientific method, which hasn't really changed much in 40 years.
Sure, absolutely.
My understanding hasn't changed.
I would love to hear from the audience too,
Okay.
questions too, if they have ideas about that. I mean, obviously I can talk, but. Well, let me just say one thing. I think that a really pleasant goal from all this would be that, we would be able to investigate both religion and science as a commonality. Yeah, that for me the commonality is that relationship with God, and so that it doesn't supersede my being a professor at the University of Georgia. It's that they're one and the same part. They're who I am at a core, who I'm designed to be. So I don't, I like what Alan said. There's a humility there. We have to keep it with an open hand, what we do not understand, in whatever realm we're talking about. So yes, I think the tails of that bell-shaped curve, where you have what we would maybe call extremists, whether It's Richard Dawkins, who I would call an extremist, or, somebody, you name a name, on the religious front. Yeah, I think that would be, those don't allow us to investigate. Those don't allow us to ask questions. They just detract. So.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with my two colleagues here. Science is interested in understanding the nature of the world. So is religion. Do they come to different conclusions? Sometimes they seem to. The seeming differences present issues to think more about, and therefore they both reinforce each other, and they lead to more of the kind of thought, reflection that science is recommending to us and religion are recommending to us. I think even if there's a disagreement in conclusion, there is a sense in both science and in religion that the process of going through the reflection and the thought is something that's valuable for us as human beings. So, yes, there's a difference, there's a commonality. That's great. We should think about these issues. And in doing so, we will be fulfilling the kind of imperative, the kind of goal that both of them have.
Hello. Just to give you an example of what I mean by an extremist fundamentalist position. And wake up the person next to you if you notice they're asleep. How many of you, I want you to raise your hand, can you see this in the back? Okay, now, how many of you think, how many of you would state that this is absolutely a false statement? Those of you who raised your hand to a degree are, I would say, extremist fundamentalists. Why? Anybody understand why? I would say that in fact this can be true. This can be a true statement. Why might this be a true statement? Yes.
I guess the question is vague because that's definitely a binary number on the left, and then you have the digit in ternary, and then you have it equal. So you can say that. But I guess what you can ask is that the vagueness of the question brings some sort of fundamentalism. If you do not stand the ground and say, the reason that I'm asking this question is because of this or some observation, then there are different solutions, different perspectives. The assumption there is that most people don't understand that the number on the left is going to be a binary number. So the lack of knowledge, maybe the lack of knowledge is exactly equal to being extremist, but I guess in your case, that doesn't really ring the bell because the ground of that equality is not completely true, because if you want to have them equal, you have to put the left side in parentheses and the 2 at the bottom.
Yeah, so a fundamentalist extremist position is, as an example, as this example illustrates, is that you see something that someone is saying is true. If it doesn't seem right to you, you immediately say it's absolutely false. Whereas a position that is not fundamentalist and extremist might ask, how, okay, granted, this appears to be false, but if it is true, how could it be true? From what perspective could it be true? And you correctly answered that the number on my left, if this is in a decimal system, and if the number on the right is in binary, then from each of those perspectives, this would be true. But the fundamentalist extremist feels uncomfortable with this and responds to their discomfort by saying, no, it's absolutely false, being unwilling to ask the question, how could it be true if it were true? So, and I think great science and great scientists can recognize when they see something that appears to be false. They can understand the perspective from which it is false, but then they have the flexibility and also the emotional intelligence to be able to cope with the discomfort that they feel at the apparent falsehood and then ask, how might it be true? The emotional intelligence aspect here is the ability to deal with the uncertainty and to not prematurely avoid the uncertainty by insisting on a particular assertion.
Alan, it seems to me the trouble with fundamentalism is that they think they know everything about God. And I've just been reading some of the statistics, particularly Rama.
This is, by the way, Professor Ayers, Professor Emeritus, who basically established our religion department. And we have to thank him for doing that.
I must quote Rabia, the Muslim Sufi, and she had a marvelous one statement. Since no one really knows anything about God, those who think they do are just troublemakers. And that's your fundamental.
I have a question about the...
Should I pass?
Sure.
Maybe introduce yourself too.
Okay. My name is Keith Yano, and I'm a senior here. I had a question about the... Okay, that makes it easier. Okay.
Maybe some...
Semantics.
Yeah, you just got to, can you turn it up a little bit?
It seems to me we're just arguing semantics when you hold that piece of paper up, because as a former biochemistry major, I was taught that no good scientist puts up a number like that without any units of measure. So, I mean, 11 eggs doesn't equal 3 eggs, but if you want to make it difficult, we could not put units of measure and then assume that they can mean anything. It kind of seems as though you're playing devil's advocate a bit with it. Is that correct or incorrect?
Yeah, I would take that a little further and say that putting the units of measurement is along the same lines as noting the perspective, let's say from the social sciences or humanities, we note the perspective. If you're responsible, you ask, well, what is the perspective? What are the units of measurement? What is the degree to which, however you made the observation, what is the degree to which your observing instrument is affecting that? So I think we're agreeing in that. What you said is another way of putting what I said in the beginning, which is that part of the scientific method is noting. A responsible scientist notes the degree to which their observing instrument is affecting whatever it is that they happen to be observing. And from the perspective of religion, the kind of responsible believer is rigorously investigating the degree to which their own ego or their own sinfulness could be affecting whatever it is that they're saying, or the degree to which their own errors of belief might be affecting their observations or their beliefs. So I think we're talking about the same thing there. It's not just semantics, though. I think the lack of self-awareness and lack of rigorous self-inquiry causes us to make observations that absolutely affirm conflicts. And so the converse, namely certain humility or self-observation, will enhance the degree we can look past superficial conflicts like this statement and investigate solutions.
Did he answer your question? You have a follow-up?
I do not.
Okay.
Maybe later. Just say, absolutely.
There's a woman back there.
Please.
Maybe someone can run around with a microphone?
Nothing really happened.
What is your name so that we don't think of you as simply a robot or a number?
Should I just yell?
Do I have to, maybe I have to turn this off?
I don't think they're connected.
Okay.
Different systems.
My name is Na Young, and I'm a senior here at study geology. What can, besides being inquisitive and open-minded, what can we do as college students now and in the future to try to bridge this dichotomy somehow? Because I feel like it's kind of the root of a lot of problems that happen around the world, and kind of a bigger problem.
I don't know that I would argue that, this is going to sound really odd from what I said earlier, but I'm not sure open-mindedness is it. I think it's actually, I really think it's what you were talking about. I think if we have inquisitiveness about religion and science and other people's culture, and if we walk into this saying there's value because they are God-made, there is value in studying nature, there is value in knowing people. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I look around this room and I find it fascinating and intriguing because you guys look so different. And fortunately, most of you look different from me, you know. And so, but I mean, seriously, there's such a diversity here. So I really find that intriguing, but I also find that sobering and awe-inspiring because I believe it is God-imbued differences. And so I think it's more getting deeper than the old Rodney King, can't we just get along? Well, the answer is no. You know, we will not probably ever get along. We won't. But the bottom line is that a lot of that can be ameliorated, I think, by truthfully, honestly investigating and following our passions rather than being fearful of them. And I think that's where you're always going to have, sadly enough, you're always going to have folks who want to destroy. That's just because that's who we are, I think, at our core, my belief system. But I do believe that as we get together and we start discussing these sorts of issues, that there really is a commonality there of just respect and understanding that we can then bring our own belief systems into. And I find that fascinating and a lot of fun. That's why Frances, my wife, and I love traveling all over the world, is because we get challenged by other people's belief systems. It really hasn't shaken mine. I'm really more convinced that I'm right, but it doesn't mean that I have to be arrogant about it. Does that make sense? I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, I really want to know people who think they're right, if that makes sense. I like that because it challenges me. So anyway, I think that's what we do. We dig in deeper. And if you're a science major, once again, and you're religious, I think that's fabulous. You know, you make those things challenge one another.
Let's try this microphone for a second. who wants to go? Who will they quit?
Hi.
It's not working. Try the other mic.
I'll just yell. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine. Just yell so they can hear you.
Okay, great.
Or should we give them the loud?
But make sure you introduce yourself as the president and founder of the Abrahamic Alliance.
I actually am the president of an interfaith organization on campus that's just started up this semester, so I'm very interested in what you guys have to say. But to digress from emotional intelligence a little bit, from a different perspective, do you think that our creation stories lose their value if every component cannot be reconciled scientifically? Dr. Happel, I think you touched on this briefly a minute earlier, but most we read our holy books in the same way as a science textbook. Like, from a Christian perspective, do I need to wrestle with the intricacies of superstring theory in order to grasp Jesus walking on water?
I'm not a philosopher. I think that we read our texts, our holy texts, and we challenge those texts to tell us what they are. So if Job is an allegory, which by the way, I'm reading right now, and I hope it's an allegory. But I mean, the thing about it is, if we look at our religious texts and we trust that God's a whole lot bigger than what we're going to decide, and we may be wrong about what those texts are telling us. But we use good scholarly methodologies. We look at theologians across the board if we're talking about our religious texts, just like we do science in our evolutionary biology. I study all these different scientists to try to, with divergent views, to try to figure out what's going on. I don't think they have to. I don't personally believe that the Bible was put together and written as a science text, or as a philosophy text, or as a sociology text, or as a history. But I do believe it has all of those components in it to some degree. I don't know if that helps.
We're missing a microphone here. Okay. And I'll say something in answer to that in response to. One of the things that we do at a university, at least in the humanities, is to try to, one of the things we do at the university, at least in the humanities, is to try to teach people how to read texts. And part of reading texts is to raise questions about them and to challenge the texts, to look for the answers in the texts. And it seems to me we're not really doing our jobs as teachers, and you're not doing your jobs as readers if you open up a book like the Bible, like the Quran, or any other sacred text, any other important text, and are not challenging it, questioning it, reading it as any critical reader would. And part of that is to discover the ideas that are there, that are below the surface, maybe very deeply below the surface. So I don't think we need to read it in a literal way. I think it's a mistake. It's wrong. It's not fair. It's not right to pick up Shakespeare and raise questions about Shakespeare, and then pick up the Bible and say, yes, I believe it. I believe it. You're not being fair to the Bible. You're not being fair to yourself. You're not developing your mind. You're not treating it with the proper respect if you simply think you're supposed to be believing it. Part of what we're doing here is developing, in the university, is developing your minds, helping you develop your minds. And I think you should read it that way. I'm just going to go back to something I said in the introduction. I started talking about Maimonides. And Maimonides was dealing with ancient Greek philosophers, Aristotle in particular. Ancient Greek philosophers thought that the world was not created, it was eternal. And this is a serious question in philosophy. It's actually a serious question in modern science, but I don't want to get into that. Maimonides said, look, if it turns out that science is really a definitive argument that the world was eternal and not created, we're going to have to go back to the account that we have in Genesis, and we're going to have to interpret it in some other way. And we can do that. And part of what we're going to use to understand the text is everything that's available to us, including all of our science. So just to echo what Michael said earlier, we shouldn't be afraid of these issues. We should pursue the issues. And we should develop our minds, and if there's one imperative that we should take away as a religious imperative, it's to, I want to say this, I can't say it without smiling a little bit, because the Army beat me to it. Be all that you can be. Develop your minds in the most serious way that you possibly can. And that includes asking questions that religion asks. And science asks it too. And
one of the, to continue to address Caitlin's question, our religious traditions, I think we can continue to argue for whatever our faith commitments tell us we should argue for, whatever we believe in. We shouldn't, as my colleagues were saying, we shouldn't be afraid of pursuing discussions based on whatever our faith commitments are. What we should do, however, is to recognize through rigorous self-inquiry, we need to recognize that at any moment, as Islam, we find in the Quran, we should recognize that our egos, in the nafs la'amaratu bisu, that our egos command us to evil, and that this is an avenue through which Satan can distort even the actions and beliefs of a pious believer. Or from a Christian perspective, the mote in our eye can always be distorting whatever it is that we're seeing. So we have to be very careful to recognize the degree of that distortion. Or you could say the mote in our iPad or iPod or iPhone is always distorting us unconsciously. Or from a Buddhist perspective, the Buddhist has to recognize that the minute they become attached to anything, that attachment can distort their observations. And we could go on and give examples from other traditions as well. So there's no need, I think, to go the route of modernistic philosophy and education, which says you have to get rid of your biases. I don't think you have to get rid of your faith commitments. But I do think that it's important to become aware of any factors that might be distorting our understanding.
What I'd like to do is take a questions hand here. So you've been holding up your hand for quite a while, so I'll take your question first, and then we'll wrap it up shortly. So.
Okay, with regards to the question, can science and religion benefit from one another? It seems as though that among the panelists there is agreement, maybe in different manners and in different degrees, that's fine. I was looking for a contrarian point of view. In other words, is it ever the case that science comes as a detriment to religion or vice versa?
Personally, I think that's impossible. And let me tell you, from my personal belief system, I think it's impossible if there is a true religion, if there really is a God, then He's created all of this. Then by definition, you know, it's not debilitating or it's not destructive and it's not when you have conflicts between the two, those are actually positive things. When I've heard people, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but I've heard people say that they can be destructive for one another, let's say, in one way or another. From either perspective, that's generally people are talking about conflicts between the two, at least perceived conflicts. Personally, I think those conflicts are good. When we see those in science, let's divorce it for a moment from any kind of religious discussion. When we have two paradigms that are in conflict, that is when you see much of the scientific growth and knowledge, because that conflict leads us to test the heck out of those different paradigms to see which one might hold up. And so that may be only my personal view, but I don't believe they're destructive when someone is really truly pursuing religion/science. I just think conflicts are normal, and so I actually look for those in my scientific career. Where is there a conflict so we can actually attack and see why there's a conflict there? Why do we not understand something? So maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I don't think that there's a destructive nature.
I think I would agree that when scientists do make certain statements, these can definitely be detrimental to religious believers. But when this happens, it's often when science has become like an extremist fundamentalist belief. And what cultural historians and historians of science call this is when science becomes scientism. Now, how does science become scientism? Basically, what scientism is, in a nutshell, is when scientists make statements that exceed the justification of the evidence. For example, if a scientist makes a statement, God doesn't exist, because if we define God, if we talk about what we mean by God as, let's say, a reality that is beyond comprehension, beyond observation through instruments, and if a scientist says God doesn't exist, basically what they're saying is that the only valid data can come through the instruments of science and its observations. But what actually scientists and not believers in scientism tell us is that instruments have degrees of what they can observe. And so if by definition we define God as having a transcendent aspect, then science cannot make a statement one way or another about the existence of God. Using a telescope, in other words, using a telescope, if you say the only valid data is going to come through a telescope and I don't see God in my telescope, or the only valid data is coming through looking at God through a microscope and I don't see God there, that's scientism. It's the assertion that my source for valid knowledge is the only valid source. Science doesn't say that, as far as I understand. The scientific method does not make the assertion that the only valid source of knowledge is what I'm using to make an observation, and that So that gives me license to then make an assertion about God. So scientism, when one goes beyond the scientific method and starts making observations about what by definition transcends observation, that's when one moves from science into scientism. And that's where you have conflicts.
Okay, I want to be just quick here, but just to throw something out. One of the ways I think in which my colleagues here and I disagree is on what the very nature of religion is. And we don't really have time to pursue this, and it's very difficult to pursue in a forum like this. But I noticed that Michael was talking repeatedly about belief systems, and that's how Christianity perceives religion. It's a set of beliefs, and different people have different set of beliefs. And that's, I don't want to say that that's illegitimate, but it is a perspective on what religion is all about. And I think that Alan has a very different sense of what religion is about. Islam has a code of conduct and also a set of beliefs and a set of relationships with God that are important. And I want to suggest to you that Judaism has still a different notion of what religion is about. So in Judaism, there are beliefs. You can find them. Some people have taken the trouble to set them out, what are fundamental beliefs. But what really counts is action. And that means that in Judaism, ethics is really very important. You've heard about those 10 commandments. Those are only the 10 big ones. The Jewish idea is there are 613 commandments that are stated in the Bible. And in fact, the rabbis try to refine them and make sure that people didn't transgress, and they added some more to those 613. Not added, but they refined them, so they made them a little bit more, they protected the law, shall we say. My point is that for Judaism, religion is a code of conduct, and the code of conduct accomplishes a couple of different things. It allows people to live together in a community. Because if you think about it, you can't really have a community where people are stealing or they're killing each other. It just, it happens, of course, in every community, but that undermines the community and people can't live together. We really need to live with each other. And also, the code of conduct allows us to realize our human nature. As I said before, to be what we can be, to develop ourselves. Now, why is this? Think about it. If you're going to, there are lots of things that people do that seem to be very attractive, but are really very destructive. And sometimes it's hard to tell the destructive things from the non-destructive things. The idea is that if you follow the commandments, you're going to actually be able to do the things that are going to be beneficial to you, and that will put you in a position to develop your faculties and to realize the kinds of things that you're capable of doing. So I want to answer the question here simply by saying, yes, some of the ways that the Bible describes God and some other things don't seem to be consistent with science. And I think that's important, and it's important to think about. And it may turn out in the end that they're not consistent with the science, and that's really, I see that as a kind of imperative, a kind of requirement for us to think more about these issues and to be honest with ourselves, not to feel threatened by the questions, and to recognize that, hey, the more we think about this, it may turn out that we're going to have to reject some things that seem to be fundamental to religious practice, I would say.
I agree.
Okay, but there's a but coming here, right? No? Okay.
But it's more than that.
I knew there was a but.
The Hasidic movement and Abraham Heschel,
Yes.
he goes beyond just ethics. I mean, ethics is important and basic, but I love Abraham Heschel's work, and it has spoken to me, even though I happen to be a Christian. Heschel is just terrific, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a fan of Heschel as well, but I find it, I'm a fan maybe for different reasons, because I think there's also, in addition to the ethics, there's also a metaphysics. And I find that the metaphysics that's involved in religious belief and practice to be very interesting and challenging. But that gets me into, should I say it? I hesitate to mention this word without sounding like Madonna, but I find Kabbalah really very intellectually interesting. Now very intellectually interesting, okay? So I think Kabbalah is actually very philosophical. But but that's not the topic of our panel here. We're really talking about science, and I think that one of the reasons and one of the ways in which religion could be very useful and compatible with science is that it supplies us with a code of conduct through which we could actually develop ourselves and pursue science. Now you might say, and I think this is one of the things on people's minds. Well, wait a minute. There's certainly a lot of people who are really pretty nasty folks who violate religious commandments right and left, and they're great scientists, right? And that might be the case. I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for that. What I know is that for me, I'm a lot more productive when I'm following the straight and narrow. And if other people could be productive without that, great. But it seems to me there's a set of laws and rules that actually help us function. And if we can understand religion like that, then it's a means to a greater end.
I think we take one really brief question, but we have to wrap it up really quickly. And you, right? You were raising your hand for like the last half hour. Someone's been raising their hand quite a bit, and I can't remember what the rock, paper, scissors.
Both of them, so take both of their questions.
Okay, all right, we'll take both the questions. Thank you.
Hello. Alright, in the major monotheistic religions of the world, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, there's a sense of fear or respect for God. How can you convince extremists to be critical observers without thinking that they're in a way of offending God?
Oh, boy. Short answer is you can't. So let me just talk, I don't know. We'll have to let these guys do it from the other religions. The short answer for me is that my associates who are dead set against certain scientific, like evolutionary biology, but scientific theories, and by theory I mean well-established assemblage of facts. I'm not talking about, oh, well, that's a theory, we use that. I'm talking about evolution as a well-established series of facts. I am considered a heretic, okay? And amongst that fringe element, I suppose, maybe we would call it. And I just think you have to let them sit and do their stuff. Because I just don't think we should waste a lot of energy trying to convince someone in that camp to be thoughtful. I don't know about, from other religions, but that would be my sense over the past 35 years of being an evolutionary biologist and a Christian, who believes that the Bible's the Word of God. I mean, that that really gets you into a dilemma there. And so I just leave them alone. I don't know what to tell you. I engage, but once I sense that, I step away from it because I just don't think it's healthy for them, and I know it's not healthy for me. It really doesn't help you. I didn't give you 10 rules to go through to get to extremists, but I can find them in a heartbeat, but I don't know how to dialogue.
Okay. The short answer is that it's important to dialogue with even fundamentalists if you can. The long answer, I'm going to start, or at least a little longer answer, is that we need to combine the Jewish ethical perspective that was, I think, articulated by Hillel in one of the key ethical statements in Judaism: if I am not for myself, who will be for me? So there's something at risk here when we have a fundamentalist and is facing us. There's something about our survival that's at risk. So we need to be for ourselves. But at the same time, if I am for myself only, what am I? So we have to realize that the fundamentalist, to a certain degree, we're connected to that fundamentalist. We're living here in a community with that fundamentalist. We can try to isolate ourselves, but ultimately that's going to come back and hurt us if we don't realize that the fundamentalist extremist is together living with us as part of the community of human beings. But if not now, when? So we have to do something, we have in some way now. Now, how do we do that? That's kind of a Jewish ethical statement there and guideline. I think we also need to recognize that if I am, again, along those guidelines, how can I integrate being for myself so that I don't get attacked by the fundamentalist? How can I integrate that with being for the fundamentalist or for the community in which we're living? And what can I do about it right now? In other words, what can we all do right now in response to her question, to her reminding us of the fundamentalist and the conflict there? This is the question. What can we do right now? Well, the answer is what we can do right now is we're concerned. We're afraid. We're concerned. And how can we act and how can we relate to ourselves in a way that fear does not distort our actions and our speech? And how can we relate to our fear in a way that our wisdom is enhanced to the point where maybe we could see an opening, a particular phrase, a particular time that would be the optimal time and the optimal way of putting our perspective an optimal way of putting our perspective, an optimal time to the fundamentalists so that the fundamentalists could move toward dialoguing with us and we could move toward dialoguing with them. And this is where the emotionally intelligent aspect of each religion, as well as the emotional intelligence even of atheistic culture, can play into the equation, can factor into the equation. In other words, to the degree that I am not pushed around by my own fear, and that gets back to what my colleagues were saying, it's important not to be bullied by our fear. So to the degree we can relate to our fear in an emotionally intelligent way, this can, it will most likely lead to our having the greatest likelihood of making a wise decision and coming up with the wisest approach at relating to the fundamentalists. So there is no blanket statement about how we should act toward that fundamentalist, but we need to not be, in the very least, bullied and by our fear. We need to not let our fear distort our judgment. And to the degree we don't let that fear distort our judgment, this will optimize our ability to wisely approach the fundamentalist or any difficult situation.
I think fundamentalism has a different meaning for different traditions. There's a really wonderful tradition of Islamic philosophy, and the Islamic fundamentalists reject it, and I think it's tragic. Christian fundamentalists are people who believe the Bible and want to take it literally without interpretation. And I think that that's unfortunate. And in my tradition, in Jewish tradition, the fundamentalists, sometimes they're identified as they're called Haredim. Ultra-Orthodox is the way the press represents them. These are people who who tend to reject secular learning. And what they do is they say, everything's in the Torah and the Bible. There is no need to read other texts besides Jewish texts. And I think that's unfortunate. I agree with the points my colleagues here. It's very difficult to convince people otherwise. But one of the strategies that I think is most likely to be productive is to show people who are fundamentalists that the religious texts themselves command something else, and that's a matter of interpretation. There's a passage in the Bible that says the Torah speaks in the language of man. It talks to us in a way that we can understand. And if you want to convince fundamentalists not to be fundamentalists, the way to do that is not to tell them secular learning is great, but to say, look, here's what the Torah says. There's an imperative in the Torah for you to develop your intellect. And I think that's what Maimonides was doing when he was talking about Job and what the meaning of Job was about.
So I'm actually being asked